Well, welcome to the economics class for dummies. Those at the top have so much power that they deserve extraordinary wealth. Where has the word deserve come into it rather than earned? That way of thinking about the world is really why we're in the mess that we're in. The Elon Musks and Donald Trumps, to what extent is their wealth and power justified? I built it up and I worked really, really hard. I give it to my children because they're my children. What's wrong in that? Because your children were born to you, they were able to live lives of dignity and other children were not. I think the reason why people struggle to pay taxes in this country is because they don't know where the money is going. How are we encouraging people to be successful if what we're saying is that the more you make, the more we'll slash you? To fix the issues that we have in politics, we need to get rid of those attitudes and figure out how we can work together. These groups of people that are going to be the change makers, isn't that what the government and the politicians are meant to be? Yeah, it is what they're meant to be. How on earth do we change that? Politicians should be as scared of the people voting for them as they are of the people giving them the money. People who have been involved in the struggles, I want to see them in positions of power. Why do you hate someone like Jeff Bezos so much? Hey everyone, it's Shivani and welcome back to another episode of Millennial Mind. Today's episode is your official permission slip to finally understand the economy in a way that actually makes sense. I'm joined by Grace Blakeley, economist, journalist, and now author of the explosive new book, Vulture Capitalism. We're breaking down the systems that shape your paycheck, your rent, and your future. And most importantly, we're giving you the economics masterclass that you should have been taught in school. So if you've ever felt like the economy was designed to be confusing on purpose, it's because it kind of is, but not today. Before we get into this episode, I have a tiny little favor to ask you all. In order for me to get these incredible guests on this podcast, it would mean so much to me if you could press that like, follow, and subscribe button because you have no idea how much it helps. I'm so nervous, but also excited to learn so much in this episode. Let's get into it. Grace, welcome to Millennial Mind.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited, but also quite nervous because I know absolutely nothing about the economy. And when I was researching and I was looking at all your videos, all I kept thinking was, oh my God, you're so smart. How am I going to interview you? I'm going to sound so stupid next to you.
I genuinely think this is the problem. It's a big problem, actually, in how economics is spoken about.
Right.
Because there's this problem of the fact that there's this vocabulary that people who talk about it a lot all understand.
Yeah.
And so you slip into using these words over and over again until they kind of lose all meaning.
Yeah.
And then you say like fiscal policy to the average person, like, of course, fiscal policy.
There I'm like Googling, like, what does that mean? Is she going to think I'm dumb?
No, it's really good to have this discipline of actually being forced to really explain what you mean. Because if you can't do that, you don't actually understand what you're talking about, right?
Well, welcome to the economics class for dummies. I am the dummy and I want to know everything. But before we kind of get into that, tell me a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I am a writer. I am a socialist. I have been writing and kind of appearing in the media and doing these sorts of things for, quite a long time now, probably about 8 years. I started out after university working at a think tank, which sounds kind of weird. Whenever I say that, people imagine like brains in a fish tank or something. But it's actually just me and a few other people working together to kind of develop policy ideas that you then work with political parties to try and introduce. We were working very closely with Labour at the time. I ended up doing a lot of advocacy, kind of thought leadership and stuff for Labour around 2017 and 2019. Started appearing more in the media, doing question time I was up against Jacob Rees-Mogg on question time when I was like 24 or something, which was bizarre. And as I was just saying to you, the Daily Mail wrote a hit piece on me calling me a Moe Marxist, which was great. I have just published a book that you just mentioned, Vulture Capitalism, which came out last year. Now out in paperback.
You said you're a socialist.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean?
Well, the way I understand it, right, is that I believe in a genuinely democratic economy and society. I don't believe that we should live in a world in which a small number of very wealthy and powerful people get to shape the conditions of existence for everyone else. I basically believe that people should be in control of our most important social and economic institutions, that we should be working together to plan our lives rather than taking kind of order and direction from powerful politicians, powerful business leaders, which is a different understanding of socialism than I think a lot of people have in their heads. Because I think a lot of people think of socialism as you want a big government to come in and kind of dictate what everyone else should have, right?
Right.
And actually for me, and this is what I write about in the book, Vulture Capitalism, the government is often just as implicated in all the unfairness and the inequality and the unsustainability of the systems that we have today as private businesses are. Now, this was a very scandalous argument when I made it, but now we literally have Donald Trump and Elon Musk working together in the White House, and it's become very clear that these two, the public and private sector aren't as separate as you might think. So for me, the focus is about democracy. It's about empowering people rather than having these kind of top-down, centralized, authoritarian systems, really, that you see in big business and in big government.
My question to you is people, let's say the people who are the politicians and are in the governments, who are those authoritative figures that you're talking about, aren't they best equipped to make those decisions because they've worked hard to focus on those policies or those decisions, and now they're the most equipped people to deal with them? Because someone like me doesn't have any knowledge, as you know, on the economy. So how would I be a good person to decide? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I'm glad that you brought it up, because that way of thinking about the world is really why we're in the mess that we're in, right?
Okay.
So the kind of societies that we live in rely on the idea that there is a kind of natural ruling class. Right?
Or an expert, I guess.
Exactly, or an expert class. But even just like actually, there's a class of people who are just better, more intelligent, more capable than everyone else. Okay. And they should be the ones who are in charge. I mentioned to you that I did this degree at Oxford, politics, philosophy and economics, right? This is a degree that so many of our prime ministers have done. Right. It was designed initially as a way to kind of support people to govern the British Empire. This was a way of kind of training the British ruling class, right? Wow. And it continues in that role in some ways to this day, although I am somewhat of an exception. Even in, the world of economics, there's this idea that the entrepreneur is some sort of kind of like mythological figure who's able to disrupt complex systems and create wealth out of nothing. Really, that there are some people who are just so brilliant and so capable that they deserve extraordinary power or extraordinary wealth, and to be able to basically tell everyone else what to do.
Where has the word deserve come into it rather than earned? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, it does. I mean, I think the idea of earned wealth and power comes alongside the idea of desert, right? If you have earned something, it's kind of like you deserve it.
True.
It's a way of kind of justifying the inequalities of wealth and power that exist within the system. And what I find really interesting, right, is that firstly, if you look at experiments throughout history when workers have taken control of factories or communities have decided how their local budgets are going to be spent, I look at these quite a lot in the book, you see that actually they may often make more sensible decisions than the people who've been sent in to manage them. People will often see this in, like, for example, the NHS. You put layers and layers and layers of managers in who are all directing everyone. And actually, if you just gave more power to the nurses and the doctors and the patients and said, let's come together and figure it out, they would do a much better job. Lots of workers will say, actually, my manager makes me less efficient.
Yes.
But what they do is reinforce this idea that someone has to be in charge, someone has to be at the top, and their position, their wealth and their power is justified. Right. Now, if we look at like the Elon Musks and Donald Trumps of this world, to what extent is their wealth and power justified? I think it's really interesting with Elon Musk that there's this kind of hero worship of him. And yet, if you look at the links that exist between Musk's corporations and the government, he would say, I'm this free market figure that never relies on any help or support from anyone else. And that's just factually not true.
Why?
Again, because, so much of his wealth relies on these interactions with the government, relies on public sector contracts. And now, if you look at the value of many of his assets, the way that they rose upon his collaboration with Trump, that's how these things work. Political and economic power feed into each other, so that when you get kind of extremely wealthy individuals, they're able to change politics. And when you get politicians intervening in the market, they tend to boost their backers, basically.
Okay. I think I'm getting it. I think I'm actually understanding what you're saying, which is really
is it making
great
sense?
for me.
Good.
What I think you're saying is instead of people who are really rich, like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, deciding what our policies should be, it should be us who are deciding what our policies should be.
I wish I'd said it like that. You made it sound so much more
When you were
simple.
nodding, I was like, oh God, have I got it wrong again?
No, that is exactly right.
This is really interesting. I used to work at Eon, which is an energy company. And when I was working there, I went to Warwick Business School and we were talking around very similar things, actually. And there were several modules. And one of the things that was really important for me was actually applying what we learned at the course into the office. Now, one of those things was around giving freedom to the employees to decide on certain things. I used to manage a team in the call center. And when you manage a team in the call center, you tell them what their breaks are. You tell them when they should be on the phones and the other ones should be doing the back end work. You tell them when they should go for lunch. You tell them exactly what to do constantly. A lot of the stuff that we learned in the course was actually about empowering the teams. Number one, using strengths-based leadership to make them understand what they were really good at and focus only on that. But number two, to empower them to decide how their day should run. When I started doing that, we saw a significant change within the team, reduced retention, reduced sickness, reduced people coming in and saying, unhappiness, right? People were so much happier and they were actually more productive. And I was going back and I went to my parents' house the other day and I saw a book they'd written for me. And I remember I used to put quotes up on the board every morning and show us how we can think differently, but also empower the individuals to make the decisions for themselves instead of me telling them. What that also meant was that the days that I wasn't there, they were just as productive because they were accountable to each other instead of being accountable to me. So I kind of understand what you're saying because I guess I used to do that when I was managing a team. And when you think about it, I was talking to my friends about this yesterday because I was so nervous about this podcast. I was like, what am I going to ask her? What are we going to talk about? And we were saying that I think the reason why people struggle to pay taxes in this country, right, when they're so high, is because they don't know where the money is going. If I knew where my taxes were going, which, if I'm honest, I have to take responsibility. I haven't researched or Googled, so let's just be honest here. But if I knew that they were going to people in need, if I knew they were going to build social housing, if I knew that they were going to, helping save this many lives in the NHS, would I be whining and complaining about it? I don't think so. I really, really don't. I think if you told people who earn a lot of money at the top, would you donate, let's just say donate 50% or 40% to people who are really struggling? I think if you were a good person and you saw the impact that was having, it would help. But what we're constantly fed is this narrative of, but no one on this, it's so unsafe in London. There's nothing that being spent. The mayor's doing X, Y, and Z. It's so negative. And so people feel that they don't want to pay their taxes because it's going in the bin.
Yeah.
Does that kind of make sense?
It completely and utterly makes sense. And it's why, this is kind of what makes me a socialist as opposed to like, a social democrat or just a kind of, mainstream left winger, right?
Yes.
It's the idea that it's not enough just to redistribute money.
Yes.
You have to also redistribute power.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Agree.
It's really, really important. Both because if you fail to redistribute power, then the people with power use all the mechanisms at their disposal to undermine the redistribution, which is what we've seen in recent years, right? If you think about the fallout from the financial crisis of 2008, the people with the power got bailed out and everyone else got austerity. Even though we'd been through what had been in previous years, new Labour governments that had implemented some form of redistribution, that was all reversed as soon as the powerful people got into trouble. That's what happens when you create an economy that has too great an imbalance of power. We're seeing this in the US at the moment. The other thing that I really wanted to pick up on, because I thought it was so fascinating, that story that you told about leading your team. The biggest problem, I would say, in Western societies at the moment when it comes to politics is people feeling hopeless and disempowered.
Yes.
Like they have no agency. Like no matter what they did, no matter how hard they worked, no matter how much they changed their mindset or any of that sort of stuff, their life is just going to continue getting worse.
Right.
And more than that, there's so little that they feel they can do to fight back against a system that is harming them in so many ways. And a big part of the reason for that is this, this inequality, basically, these inequalities of wealth and power that have created what seem like this unassailable elite at the top of society. You know, the average American is going to look at what is going on in their country and think, how on earth am little old me going to take on the interests of the billionaires? And the other side to that equation is the fact that we are so convinced that we're all alone. What I've been talking about so far is the fact that people at the top are very good at working with each other across barriers, across public and private sectors, whatever, to make sure that they can cooperate and collaborate. At the same time, most people aren't very good at that, especially in our individualistic, competitive society, where it's like you have to push everyone else out of the way to get to the top. You created a really healthy team dynamic there, which is the opposite of what most people have of, I'm alone, I have to do more calls than everyone else, I have to beat everyone around me, and my boss is going to direct everything that I'm doing. That's going to make you feel powerless, hopeless, depressed. And then if you see a video from Tommy Robinson or Andrew Tate, especially if you're a man, saying, I'm going to make you feel strong again, you are going to listen to that, right?
True.
So I think all of these issues are really interlinked.
You talk about, the top and the power. Talk to me a little bit about that. Break it down for me. Why is this such a problem?
So the imbalances of power and wealth in our society, and the two very much go together, are a problem for a lot of reasons. We've spoken already about whether or not these inequalities are kind of earned.
Yes.
And I think there's a really good statistic here from Oxfam, which is that 1/3 of global billionaire wealth is inherited.
Okay.
Another third comes from crony connections to government. So basically corruption of one kind or another.
In the UK?
Around the world. This is global billionaire wealth.
Okay.
And only the last third is in any way kind of earned. And that could be anything from, you're an arms company owner to an oil company owner or whatever. So you're earning your wealth at the expense of people and planet. But the vast majority isn't even earned in any real sense. It's people who have used their connections, whether that's their family or their connections to powerful people within the government, to extract wealth. And that's really what you see in economies where there are big imbalances of wealth and power. The vast majority of the very wealthiest people maintain their wealth and power through extraction rather than through any form of kind of creation or productive uses of their resources.
What do you mean extraction?
So there's this concept in economics, we're going to get into the economics now,
I need this lesson.
called economic rents, basically. Okay. Now, there are profits that come from production, right?
Yeah.
And, that's one side of things. We can talk about where those profits come from. But there are also things called economic rents, which basically just come from your ability as an owner to enclose an asset. Now, a good example of this is just housing and rents from housing, right? So if you own loads of land in an area where there's lots of economic activity, you don't have to invest anything in that land for your wealth to increase. Okay. Everyone wants a slice of that land and there's only so much of it around, right? So the value of that land is going to increase.
Yes.
You're going to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, even though you've not done anything, you've not invested, you've not earned that wealth. It's not come from any economic activity. It's just come from the fact that you own something that everyone wants and you can stop them from accessing it.
But hold on, how did you own it in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, if you're in this country, then you were probably given it by, your family would have been given it by William the Conqueror in 1066 or something.
Let's say I started this podcast, right? I haven't extracted anything, have I?
No.
Okay, so I've created a podcast.
Yeah.
Now let's say you all subscribe, which you all should, and I make £10 million from this podcast, right? I've given multiple people jobs because it's very difficult to run.
Yeah.
I've invested in a studio, right? Okay. Now, I have grown this podcast so successfully. I'm the most successful podcaster in the whole world. This is all happening for me. I'm manifesting it. Well, maybe you won't like it if I say that.
No, that's great.
I'm 90 years old and sadly I pass away, right? But I didn't get any money, by the way, from anyone. I used to work my job and I used to save aside and I used to do this podcast. So I haven't started this podcast with anyone else's money, which is true, by the way. But I built it up and I worked really, really hard and I was working 15, 18 hours a day, whatever, okay? I give it to my children because they're my children. What's wrong in that?
Well, there's nothing morally wrong with that. There's a question about whether we want to organise a society around inheritance and the privilege that that confers on some people. So I think there's a very good case for taxing those inheritances, which is what we do.
Yeah.
Exactly. We already do that. I want to take your analogy,
Yes.
right, and really try and use that to explore what an economic rent looks like. Now, first and foremost, there's a question of scale here. Most people don't understand how wealthy the super wealthy are. So the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire, for example, to count the numbers to 1 million would take you 12 days. To count the numbers to 1 billion would take you 32 years. There is an extraordinary difference in scale between a millionaire and a billionaire, let alone a multi-billionaire. These people have wealth on a scale that is unimaginable to the vast majority of people. That kind of wealth is not earned by starting a podcast and watching it grow organically. The way that it could be earned is if you, as the podcast host, realized that you could increase your wealth by buying up lots of other people's podcasts, right? Maybe you were given some money in order to do that. Maybe you had some connections that allowed you to borrow money very cheaply from a bank. So you start buying up everyone else's podcasts. Then you realize you'll make even more money if you buy up the platforms on which the podcasts are all being produced. So you think, okay, in this imaginary universe, you're going to buy Spotify and you're going to buy Apple and you're going to buy all of these other podcast platforms. So you're controlling the whole, mechanism of podcast production. Then you realize, actually, if I donated some money to this political party, I could get them to cut my taxes and actually create a tax loophole for podcasting that will allow me to make even more money. This is the difference between the system that we have now and what you're talking about, which is embedded wealth that is created through basically enclosing, so cutting off other people's access to things and using that kind of economic power to generate political power. Right. There's a big difference between starting a business, watching that business grow, right, and the mechanisms of wealth generation that are used by the world's billionaires, which are all about basically just, as I said, kind of extracting and enclosing.
I want to challenge you on a couple of things.
Please.
If I start this podcast, right, and I work really, really hard, I've been paying my 40, 50, let's say I'm a millionaire, which I'm not, but let's say I am in this imaginary universe, I'm paying 50% tax every single year, right? So I'm already paying my 50% tax. Then I've saved up this money for my children, and then I'm paying another 40% or 50% tax on inheritance, right? Do you think that that's a significant privilege that my children get?
It depends what kind of society that you live in. If you live in a society in which all of the things that you need to survive and succeed are distributed through the market, so you can pay for them basically, then yes, because you can buy your children a very expensive education. You can buy their way into very good schools. You can buy their way into elite circles that allow them to, mix with people who are going to make them rich.
True.
Also, you can give them the money to buy a house.
Yes.
Now, if we lived in a society in which housing was much easier to access. And we had, for example, secure social housing that meant that everyone had somewhere to live. That wouldn't be such a significant privilege. Sure, they'd be able to buy a bit of a bigger house than everyone else.
Got it.
Fine. But it wouldn't be the case that because your children were born to you, they were able to live lives of dignity and other children were not, right?
Yes.
So it's not just about these issues around tax. It's about how we organize access to the things that people need to survive, basically.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point you mentioned, and I really want to challenge you on that because that's what we think it is, right? Stop complaining if you live in a one-bedroom flat and that person lives in £1 million flat. That's just life. But what you're trying to say is that people don't have anywhere to live. And then there's some people who have just been given so much that they have too much. I was actually against you when you were telling your point, when you said, you mentioned an example of if I start this podcast, and then I grow it and I use my connections and I think they're all fair, by the way. I'll explain why. I have used my connections to get guests on this podcast.
Of course.
I've had to. I'm sure that, in order for you to promote your book, you have to ask somebody. I think that's normal.
Of course.
Where I switched was when you said, if I had friends in powerful places, I would tell them to change the laws. And actually, I didn't know that was happening, which is really interesting.
I can give you some really good examples. No, of course I don't. I don't.
But when you were saying that, I thought, That makes so much sense. Of course, that's what is happening. If I was so powerful and I grew this podcast so big and I bought Apple and Spotify and I bought all of these things, and then I said to, our president or prime minister at the time, you need to change this, otherwise I'm going to do this. I can totally understand why that would be totally unfair. Why are Elon Musk and Trump so openly showing their relationship then? Why aren't they hiding it and saying that there is no link between it? I'm just asking.
It's a really good question. And I have been shocked as well, because I wrote this book trying to make the argument to people who would not believe it that these forms of entrenched wealth and power exist, and that there is this cooperation between governments and, private sector interests. And I had to use loads of examples.
Right.
Like, for example, Musk is not the first billionaire in the White House. Trump, in his first term, made Rex Tillerson, CEO of ExxonMobil, his Secretary of State, right? So there are fossil fuel interests embedded in his first administration. In the UK, for example, David Cameron, our former Prime Minister, became a lobbyist for a company, Greensill, that got into trouble during the pandemic. And David Cameron, as a lobbyist for this company, as someone deeply connected with this company, started texting members of the government, the central bank, saying, you need to get this company a bailout, right? That's the kind of stuff that you can pay for if you have enough wealth and power. And the question that you asked, which is why are they doing it so blatantly? I think that it's gotten to the point now where American society in particular is so unequal, and those at the top have so much power and have so successfully challenged movements to try and change things that they think that they are basically invulnerable. They think they can get away with almost anything. And I think you're seeing this very clearly with Trump at the moment.
Yeah.
There's also a kind of, I think that there's a psychological element to it as well, which is there's something called the hubris effect, which is the longer you are exposed to power, the more basically kind of narcissistic and unself-aware you become. So you become much more grandiose. You're much more likely to kind of make big, risky decisions and think that everything will be fine, because that's the way that power affects your brain. And I'm sure there's something going on there as well. But I basically think they've gotten so arrogant and they do not think that there's anyone that can challenge them, that they just think they can get away with it. And I want to say, actually, we can challenge them.
I'm a bit scared now. I'm like, oh God, I've been oblivious to this. I just thought, how you've broken it down has been very clear to me as to why there's such a big problem. In my head, I thought very similarly to how I introduced the podcast, Elon Musk I don't know his background. I just presume he's worked very hard to get where he is. And because he is where he is and he's so influential, that's why he's working with Trump. I didn't think that, and call me stupid, but I didn't think that there was this kind of, not conspiracy, because that's not the right word, but I didn't think there was a different intention. But I don't really pay attention to him, if I'm completely honest. I really honestly don't care.
I think that's probably a very sensible strategy for your mental health, but yes.
What are your thoughts on Rishi Sunak?
Rishi Sunak was an interesting character because he was in some ways the type of person for whom I would have been writing my book. Because I think he was genuinely a kind of free marketeer.
Right.
He's someone who will have studied the economics, read all the books, and probably really thought, if we want to kind of unleash prosperity, then we need to shrink the state and cut taxes and create more room for corporations and less at a smaller state, right? Which is the narrative that a lot of people on the right use. And my book, Vulture Capitalism, it really exposes how this like big state, small state narrative is a bit of a con. Because whenever you see free market politicians getting into power, they don't actually shrink the state. What they do is they shrink the state for some people and expand it for others. And this again comes back to these questions around vested interests. And it's not a conspiracy. It's not like they decide we want to screw over poor people and support rich people. It's that when you get into power, you've got extremely influential people knocking on your door saying, if you don't do this tax change, we're going to leave. There was this example recently with Rachel Reeves wanted to close a tax loophole that benefits private equity. Which is, these are very, very wealthy people, basically. This would have been really easy, really popular. It affects a tiny number of taxpayers and would have raised quite a lot of money. But in the end, she backed off because she had these lobbyists coming to her door and saying, the entire industry will leave London if you do this. So this is why these arguments about the state and the free market don't really play in reality. And I think in some ways, Rishi Sunak, as someone who had been in the city and then went into office, might not have initially known that, but eventually it would have become very clear, because he was also one of those people who David Cameron texted saying, can you give a bailout to Greensill?
Wow.
And he was initially like, no, but eventually they got the bailout anyway.
So talk to me about taxing the wealthy.
Okay.
Or taxing the rich. Because there's a lot of confusion about this, right? I'll give you another example. Let's go back to my example of me being a millionaire. I really like this example today. Although who knows if it's going to work or not. If I, in 10 years' time, have accumulated, let's say, 10 million from this podcast, but not 10 million to my name, 10 million because an investor has come in and said, Shivani, we'll pay you 5 million for 50% of the podcast and we'll pay you 100 grand or 200 grand salary every single year. Or let's say £500,000 salary, right?
Lucky you.
I know. I would be taxed 50% on that, correct?
On that salary?
Yes.
Well, yeah, obviously above the, the cutoff
yes,
point.
Exactly. Yeah, sorry. So roughly around that. Now, when I listened to this podcast with Gary, what he was saying is tax everybody who's worth above 10 million, this extra tax. Now, why would people stay in the UK, for example? Why would they stay in the UK? Why would these wealthy individuals who are giving all these people employment? Because if I was, my podcast was valued that much, I'd have a huge team here. I'd have a vested interest to, be paying people much higher than if I was doing it anywhere else in the world. What do we say to people who have started their company here and just been really, really successful? They're not born from money. They weren't given all this handout. How are we encouraging people in this country to push harder and to grow and to be successful if what we're saying is that the more you make, the more will slash you?
I think there's two parts to this question, right? The first part goes back to what you were talking about earlier, which is about how this money is used.
Yes.
Now, if people do not trust the government, and they don't trust the government now, which I agree, I don't trust the government either. I think that's completely legitimate. I don't trust most politicians. Then they are not going to want to pay those taxes and they are going to leave. More than that, those taxes aren't going to be used in a way that creates wealth and creates more opportunities for other people to start businesses or gain employment or gain skills or, invest in research and development, right? Because it's all going to be siphoned off to basically things that are not productive.
Bailing people out, for example.
Yeah.
Right.
So, if tax revenue is used by a trusted government in a way that helps to generate opportunities for more production down the line, or in a way that helps to make employees more happy and more productive, or in a way that, facilitates, new productive mechanisms by, for example, expanding infrastructure investment or just creating opportunities, widening the economy, then that issue is not going to be something that will cause the vast majority of genuine entrepreneurs to leave, because they'll see this is a dynamic economy
100%.
in which the government is investing, in which there is social trust, and I want to be here and grow my business.
Yes.
Now, having said that, again, we need to go back to the difference between the entrepreneur and, the kind of standard business, and then the oligarchs, the uber wealthy, and these people who have generally, earned their wealth not by doing anything particularly productive and use that wealth as a way to try and kind of nefariously influence politics. Those people, a lot of them will leave, right?
Right.
So there need to be ways that you can tackle that. There are ways that you can tackle that. We in the UK have a network of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions that are connected to the City of London. Our financial system facilitates tax avoidance on a mass scale. It would be it wouldn't be easy, but it would be possible to stop that from happening, which would prevent some of this avoidance and evasion from taking place.
Give me an example of a couple of those.
The whole idea of having these networks of tax havens is that it creates layers of anonymity that allow you to hide the beneficial owner of wealth. Okay. So you might have, millions of pounds, and you can stash that in a limited company in the Cayman Islands or something. And then the beneficial owner of that company can be another company in Panama. And then the beneficial owner of that company can be another company somewhere else. So it becomes very, very difficult to trace who actually owns the money, who actually owns the resources. And each of these jurisdictions has rules around secrecy that protect people. So basically, you can just hide where your money is and how you've gotten it. That's just one example.
But how would I spend that money? If I live in the UK,
well,
and I've put 10 million from this podcast that I'm going to make into Panama, right? I can't use that money in the UK, can I?
You can get one of the shell companies to buy property in London and then use that. You can now very easily move money around quite very secretly using crypto. There's lots of different ways that you can actually access that money. It has been more of an issue in the past is how you would actually draw down income. But
that's what I'm saying.
Less so now. So but if you were to expose the beneficial owners of this capital, then that would be a massive step towards actually preventing this kind of avoidance and evasion. There's actually loads of different ways that the wealthy use to avoid and evade tax. I would really recommend, there's a great book called Treasure Islands by Nick Shaxson, which is really easy to read. And it kind of exposes a lot of these links about how, the City of London, for example, works with institutions all around the world to help people not just actually avoid tax, but often launder money. There's a huge amount of illicit money that goes through London. We found this out, for example, when Putin invaded Ukraine, the amount of just extremely dodgy Russian money that's in London property. How do you think that got there? Well, a lot of it was facilitated by Western banks. So there are lots of mechanisms in place that allow the wealthy to hide their money.
Right.
And that has to be, I would say, even before introducing a wealth tax, number one thing to do, shut down the tax havens and properly start clamping down on tax avoidance and evasion. And then finally, there is this question around what is the wealth that our country produces and the extent to which that can actually be taken away. Because I think this kind of goes back to this idea, right, that we were talking about at the beginning, that there's this special class of people who are responsible for all the good things in the world, and we just need to give them all the wealth and power, and then they'll make good decisions for us. But that's not really how the economy works. The wealth is produced by us together as we collaborate.
That's what I think. Yeah. I have actually, the statement, that's why I kept saying, I don't understand what you mean by this special. I've never thought that. I've never thought that there's a special group of people. I've thought that if I really wanted to, I could go to university and study politics. Thank God I didn't. But I could go to university and study politics, and I could become prime minister if I really wanted to. I really do believe that. Yeah. I think you should be prime minister, if I'm completely honest.
I don't think so. I don't think there's any political party that would have me.
But, I think what you're trying to say, from what I'm hearing, is it's really important that we understand why we've had this complete wealth and power inequality. But what I'm curious to understand is how on earth do we change that?
That is the question, right? Because what we were just talking about Trump and Musk basically thinking they can just get away with it. It's the issue of the day. Mm-hmm. I basically think we have a problem in politics all over the world, which is that we are waiting. All of us are kind of watching the world collapse in lots of ways. We're watching often our own lives or the lives of people around us get worse. And we're waiting for someone to kind of swoop in and save us.
Yes.
For an amazing politician or a brilliant policy that will just fix everything. This is kind of like the wealth tax thing, right? If we could just get a wealth tax and everything would be fixed.
Yes.
It wouldn't, because there are more fundamental issues here, not just about wealth, but also about power. So how do we, basically, this is the question, how do we genuinely rebalance power in our economy and in our society? The people at the top aren't going to give power away voluntarily. And we can't just wait around for some kind of heroic politician to go in and disrupt the whole system and take everyone on. That's kind of what politicians like Trump promised to do. And then, of course, they immediately go back on their word. So we really have to figure out how to work together to make demands of our political class that cannot be ignored. Now, people have been a lot better at doing this throughout history. We've had stronger labor movements where people have worked together to say, we want fair pay and good conditions. We have had community organizations that have worked to protect people in their community, and to stop sell-off of public assets, to protect people during times of hardship, and even to kind of work within local government to say this is how our resources should be spent. We've also had powerful social movements focusing on questions of women's rights and sex and race and all of these other things that have really led movements that have generated massive changes in our societies. We need a movement like that, and that requires all of us really to do what we've been talking about, right? Both of us have identified this issue coming from very different perspectives of the need to collaborate and work together.
I agree.
Like, there's this ideology in our society that you're on your own, you have to fight with everyone to get to the top, that strength means like being completely independent. And I think to fix the issues that we have in politics, we need to get rid of those attitudes and figure out how we can work together to try and make a better society.
How do you suggest we do that, though? Because in practice, it's very difficult, isn't it? Some people are just not interested, though.
You know what? I think more people are interested than you would think. I actually write a weekly Substack called What Can We Do, where I speak to a different kind of organizer or campaigner from different parts of the world and ask them how they got into it and how other people can join their movement. So last week, I spoke to someone who was organizing all of the kind of employees of the federal government in the US who are now starting a union to fight back against Musk and Trump coming in and saying, you're all fired, basically.
Right.
Fascinating movement. And they all were a big part of the protests that took place in the US last week. Before that, I did a fascinating interview with some students in Serbia who have been mobilizing in the biggest protests in the country's history. Basically, a railway station collapsed and these students identified government corruption as the problem. And so they have launched these huge protests that have brought in all different areas of society to say, we have had enough of government corruption. And this has already create a huge change in Serbian society. I've spoken to climate activists, to people who've organized, Starbucks workers in the US, Amazon workers, all of these different people who've identified a problem. And rather than just saying, okay, well, this is an issue, I better, work on it myself all alone, have instead figured out other people who are also suffering and built these movements that have, in some cases, become really powerful to actually change things.
What's really interesting, though, is that, these groups of people that are going to be the change makers, isn't that what the government and the politicians are meant to be?
Yeah, it is what they're meant to be.
Does that
make
make
sense?
sense?
Their way, 100%.
Aren't people who go to university and say, I really want to study politics or PP or economics, and I want to go into parliament, I want to make sure that I'm campaigning, I want to make sure that I'm putting this... Aren't they meant to be those people? That's why I'm so confused, because how do we know that other people won't lose their way? And how are these workers that we're talking about, for example, going to manage their jobs and also this at the same time?
I think a big part of the problem is that politics has become really disembedded from the rest of society.
It has.
So it's become its own kind of career path. Historically, one of the main ways that kind of Labour Party politicians would come up into the Labour Party would be that they would be organisers or unionists, and they would, basically kind of build political movements, build support locally, and then they would come from that experience of actually listening to people's concerns, working with those people, and saying, I'm going to take your concerns into Parliament where I'm going to represent you. This was Nye Bevan, who was basically the man who created the NHS in Labour. He was from a very poor town in Wales and basically was a unionist and represented miners in this very poor town who had these appalling conditions that they were dealing with. And his whole reason for going into politics was, I want to help my community.
Wow.
I want to make your lives better. And then ultimately that led to the creation of the NHS.
Wow.
So the fact that we now have kind of professional politicians who are just like, I just want to go into politics. And often, actually, I'm not saying that they have negative intentions. I don't believe that. But I think there is a problem that they are not sufficiently linked to the people they're supposed to be representing. They're not sufficiently accountable. And part of that is because we aren't organised enough to be able to say, this is what we're demanding. I did an interview a while ago with The Times, and one of the quotes that they led with, which I think was supposed to make me sound really scary, but which I think really true, is that politicians should be as scared of the people voting for them as they are of the people giving them the money. Now, what does that mean? It means that they should be just as worried about having a constituent knock on their door and saying, you voted for, I don't know, benefit cuts or this tax cut or whatever that harmed me, as they are of the private equity guy knocking on the door and saying, if you don't implement this tax change, then I'm going to leave.
Why wouldn't you want to be prime minister then?
Oh gosh, well that was a bit of a turn. I think it's what I've just been talking about, right?
Okay.
I love what I do. I'm fascinated by these conversations, and I really enjoy feeling like I'm talking to people in a way that makes them feel empowered so that they can go out and take action in their lives. I don't think I'm the right person, coming from a pretty well-off background and not actually ever, I haven't really ever had a real job for an extended period of time. I've just been a kind of intellectual and a writer.
Right.
I don't think I'm the right person to go into politics and say, this is where we're going. I want to see people who have been involved in the struggles that people throughout this country are suffering from. I want to see them in positions of power. And so, for me, my job is like encouraging those people who maybe don't see themselves as the type of people who should go into politics to say, take action.
I love that, actually. That's a really fair argument. And I think what you're saying is that there's people who are experiencing these things day to day. They need to be the ones that are actually changing the policy.
Yeah, that's
and they
what I
need to be
think,
the ones that are encouraging it. Why do you hate someone like Jeff Bezos so much?
I don't hate him personally, but maybe I should.
I saw a quote, actually. It was so funny. I was uploading some quotes and I have this quotes folder saved on my phone.
Oh, yeah.
And it was a picture of him and it said Amazon. And I don't know if you've seen it. It's in like a garage.
Oh, no.
And it said like Amazon on it. And it was him, like when he just started in this tiny garage. And it just was a quote about not giving up on your dream. And I thought, I better not post that because, I'm a bit scared. But, why do you think people like him are the problem? Because I guess their intention in the beginning was to just start out, build a company from nothing, employ all these people. Do you think they're just greedy? Do you think we are inherently greedy, by the way?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I certainly think that, as I've already said, exposure to wealth and power changes the way that you think.
Yeah, true.
So even if you start out with those kinds of intentions, just think about the pressures that you are under as someone in that position of power. You have lots of people, shareholders, staff, whatever, who are saying, we need to constantly be increasing profits because it's not just about your wealth, it's about the wealth of all of these other people as well. And that generally ends up pushing you to make decisions that maybe initially you would not have taken.
Yes.
That's not because of who you are as a person.
Right.
That's because of the structure of our economy. There is this pressure to endlessly grow and accumulate. Like, enough is never enough.
Yeah.
It's always got to be bigger. There's always got to
true.
be more. And that's not something that you as an individual can resist. Because if your shareholders start thinking, oh, well, he's not committed to growing the company at any cost, then you're out. So that's not about bad individuals, although there are obviously some bad individuals. I think Elon Musk is probably one of them. But it's more about the structures of the economy and society and the incentives that they create.
Do you think billionaires should exist?
No.
Why?
Because I do not believe in a world where a small number of powerful human beings are able to control political and economic power to an extent that excludes millions, if not billions, of other people from having access to that political and economic power. I don't have a problem with the existence of inequality. Inequality is always going to exist, right? What I have a problem with is when those inequalities become so pronounced that they compromise the ability of some people to have agency in their lives, because all of the policies, all of, the most important decisions about the way we run our society and our economy are taken by those with the wealth and the power. I don't think that that's right. And I think that, it's not just the number a billion, it's what the idea of a billionaire represents, which is just something that is so far out of the imagination of anyone that they're able to use that power to basically change the world in their interests.
What's really interesting about what you're saying is that I don't know if I'm contradicting what you're telling me, because this podcast is all around growth. I would say my platform is all around self-development and self-growth. And I really want to encourage people to be better and to do better, and in some cases to get more money, to get more freedom, to get more success. Now, is capitalism always a bad thing? Because are we saying that growth is a bad thing? So you know the example that we gave about me starting my podcast and growing it?
Yeah.
The reason I said I was against you on it is because I don't think it's a bad thing if I start this podcast and then I have more money. Not that somebody gave me money, but I was making loads of money from this podcast from YouTube, let's just say, because this video is going to get 100 million views, let's just say. And with that money, I then invested it into buying someone else's podcast. But in buying someone else's podcast, I have to help them also grow their podcast, right? If I want to buy someone's business, I can't just say, hey, I want to buy it. I need to be growing it. So I have the skills and the knowledge that I've worked all my life for to then make money from this podcast. I've then been successful. I've then bought another podcast and another podcast and another podcast, right? Now I've bought Spotify and I bought Apple because I'm really, really good at doing it, because I worked really, really hard at it, because I was pushing myself, not because I had a connection at Apple and I wanted to buy it, right? It was based on merit. What's wrong in that?
I would question the extent to which the differences that exist between the people who do succeed and the billions of people on the planet who don't get those opportunities are all about merit, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a starting point there that we just have to account for. Is that some people are just in such poverty, they're never going to be able to do anything.
100%.
Right?
I agree on that.
So that's just, to one side.
Yes.
But there are obviously differences in terms of people's skills and abilities and talents, right? And you're quite right that it is really important, and I would agree it's really important for people to feel like they can grow personally,
right,
and that they can kind of realize their full potential. In fact, that's why I'm a socialist, because I think, people should all be able to realize their full potential. Now, what's interesting about our economy, and again, I'm going to go back to this example to illustrate this of the podcasts, because you said that you were going to buy the other podcasts and then support these other people to grow their podcasts. What monopolies do, and this has happened in a number of cases, is that they buy up potential competitors and then shut them down because they're potential competitors.
Got it.
So you find a potentially disruptive new startup, and because you have such vast amounts of money, you can offer the entrepreneurs 10 times what the company is worth. Take that insight and maybe you'll develop it, maybe you won't.
Makes
but
sense.
the idea is not that you are expanding opportunities for other people. It's that you are augmenting your own power and making sure no one else can challenge you. It's kind of what Donald Trump is doing right now with his tariffs, right?
Yeah.
He's wrecking the world economy because he hopes that he can wreck other people's economies a little bit more than he wrecks his own economy in order to destroy his enemies and preserve his own power. These questions around power are really important, and they're not often looked at by economists who just kind of think in terms of numbers and like abstractions. But you really need to think about how people are going to use their wealth to embed their power and the links between those two things.
Okay, so instead of me buying these podcasts to help them grow and keep them alive, I'm basically buying them out. And that's what you're saying is the difference, right? So it's not that you're anti-growth, which is really interesting, because sometimes when I watch people, I think, so you don't want people to grow, but that's not what they're saying. You guys are saying that you don't want people to grow so much that the most powerful person just buys you out and you yourself are happy. Because if someone offered me, let's say, for example, I don't know, the biggest podcast out there said to me, Shivani, I feel like you're growing. And they did that to me and they said, I'll pay you 10 million. I'm not going to give the 10 million to everyone in my team, am I? I mean, realistically, you're not. You're going to pay them their wage. You might give them a bonus, but you're not going to be like, oh, let me distribute this 10 million out between all 100 of us. You're not. So those people, you're actually ruining their lives. And that's why this is actually very interesting. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look,
it's quite simple, actually, when you think about it. I'm like, gosh, this is so simple.
This is my view, right? And I don't think that everyone on the left would share this view. I don't think that, most people who talk about economics would necessarily share this view either. But
what would their view be?
I think there is this strand of thinking on the left, which is just like, we just need to tax people more and redistribute things and everything will be fine. We don't have to fundamentally change the balance of power, which I would disagree with. I think if you're an economist, you basically think we can fix the system just by like tweaking around the edges, by kind of changing regulation or changing tax rates or whatever. And I'm saying, again, you need to think about power. You need to think about who's making the decisions.
Yes.
This is very much my perspective. And I think it is becoming, unfortunately, more obvious to a lot of people that there's some truth in it. I think for most of the time that I've been studying economics, it's been very difficult to say to people, you need to think about politics and power when you are analysing the labour market, when you're thinking about developing government policy. Because there's this idea that the market will kind of sort everything out, that there are these like abstract forces of supply and demand. And if you just step back and let everything take its course, then things will end up just in the end. And that perspective doesn't take into account the way that people are able to manipulate what happens within markets. They're able to manipulate the structures of markets. They're able to manipulate what happens within politics. But now that is clear.
Yeah.
And it's almost like the point at which it's become obvious, it's kind of too late to make these arguments, because the only people who are really speaking to people's anger at how corrupt and unequal the system has become in any kind of mass way are far right politicians who are basically like, you're poor because of migrants. And,
Yes.
you know, the only way that we're going to change this system is by kicking them all out, giving all the power to me, Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen or whoever. And then, you know, they're going to get into power and they're not actually going to fundamentally change any of the things that they're talking about. You know, I think it's really important for us to know that this message about the links between
Yes.
political and economic power is true. But I also think we need to take the next step, which is don't despair. Don't think the system is completely rigged against me and there's nothing I can do. Actually, there is plenty that we can do. And if we do give in to despair, that actually ends up helping these far right grifters, basically, who want us to think that there's nothing that we can do to change things and we just need to burn the whole thing to the ground.
So what are the small actions we can take to kind of fight against this unfair capitalism?
So I think, you know, the small actions, I'm not going to say things like buy a different product or like reduce your carbon footprint or any of those things, because that's not the way I think about small actions. What I would say is find a way to connect with someone who shares the same challenges that you do, right? And from there, find a way to take action. Now, that could be anything. It could be like you're chatting with your friends about politics and you decide, I'm going to start a podcast where we discuss some of these issues. It could be you're chatting with, if you're, you know, a low-income worker, you're chatting with people at work and you say, actually, it's pretty unfair that we didn't get a pay increase in line with inflation. Why don't we start actually organising and thinking about how to do that? You might be looking at what's going on in the world and think, I'm so worried about something like climate breakdown. And so you join a protest or something along those lines. I think it's so important for us to build these connections, because as soon as we start doing that, it will become very clear that all of us are in the same boat. None of us want to live like this.
Yeah.
We all want to feel better. We want to feel more hopeful for the future. We want to live in a society that's fairer, that's more sustainable. And we just need to seek each other out.
In a really, really dumb way to put it, by the way, it's kind of like Mean Girls. Have you watched Mean Girls?
I have watched Mean Girls. What specific part of Mean Girls?
It's almost that if you're not friends with Regina, you don't get access to anything.
That is an extremely good analogy. Yes,
Isn't it?
I love it.
It
Yes.
really does feel like that. And the
Yes.
way you break Regina is you get to the people that are closest to her.
Oh my God, yes.
I think you
This
should be
is
stealing
genius.
this analogy from
I
me.
might use that for my next book.
That would be great.
Mean Girl Capitalism.
I would like to be quoted, please.
Of course.
Thank you. No, but if you think about it genuinely, the reason why these people are so popular is because we idolize them and we think that they're amazing. And I'm genuinely being serious. In that movie, the girls think she's the prettiest, the coolest, the funnest, the one that always gets all the boys. And you start to idolize this person, even though the people who are closest to her don't actually like her, don't value her. And I'm sure there are people who are in Parliament, you know, who don't like the way that things are running.
100%.
And they want to hear from people, but it's just about how do you get through to them? And doing these small things that you're saying will eventually catch their attention. So, you know, this has actually been a very interesting podcast. I feel that
I've really, really enjoyed it as well.
I think it's time to take action. I hope it's been the economics for dummies that I promised it would be. I feel like it kind of has been, but I really wanted to break it down very, very simply because we're not taught about it in school. And like you said, what you studied at university isn't necessarily what's happening in the world. And what you're flooded with online is so much polarizing information. It's so confusing. And what you've done is just really simply break it down for me. And I really also think that the root of why people are so unhappy with paying taxes, for example, you know, when talking about problems, a lot of the problems that people talk about is like, why am I paying taxes in this country? It's so unsafe anymore. And it's such a nightmare and it's so unsafe. And, you know, all of this stuff. is we don't know where that money's going.
Yeah.
If we had a choice to turn up to a meeting, let's say, I don't know, once every 3 months and say, are you interested in knowing where your money is going? Are you interested in kind of saying what you think is missing from the community?
And where you think the money
should go? I would definitely go to that.
Exactly.
100%. And if someone said, I'm going to use all of the money this month and give it to homeless people, I'd be like, do it.
And it exists. It's called the participatory budgeting movement. They do it in Brazil, in Iceland, in Canada, in like a bunch of places.
And we don't have it here.
And we don't have it here. Not yet, anyway.
Right, I really think you should start a petition to get this going. Okay. I would sign it. And I'm sure everyone else would sign it too. But you know how you said, what are the things that really impact you? There will be people in low-income households who will be saying, I really want to do something, but I don't have the time.
Yes.
So if someone could, I don't know, organise a childcare system. I was talking with my friend about this yesterday. Actually, it'd be interesting to have this debate with you, but I think we'll be on the same side. Do you think that if somebody wanted to do something that they could?
Do I think that if
somebody really wanted to do something that they could, for example, do you think everyone can make 1 hour or half an hour in their day to go for a walk?
Well, I mean, no, because some people can't walk.
but if they could walk.
If they could walk. The question hinges around this idea of can, right?
Yes.
In a way, yes, you can. But if you are a single mum who is working, extremely long hours, you come home, you're exhausted, you need to cook for your kids.
Yeah.
You need a rest. Like, you're just not going to feel able. You're not going to feel like you have the energy in the tank to be able to do that. What was the point that you were making?
Well, we kind of had a very heated discussion because she said, everything is a choice and you can if you would. And I said, if you're a single mother, for example, who's got 2 children, you wake up at 5 a.m. because they wake up at 6. You make their lunches, you drop them off to school, you then go to work, you come back home from work. You can't leave the children in the house alone. So when do you go for a walk? And, she said, you can march in your bedroom. I'm like, sorry, it's just not practical to tell people to march 10,000 steps in their room. And she was like, what about a lunch break? I'm like, but in your lunch break, let's say you work in a hospital, by the time you get out of the hospital and come back, your lunch break's over, right? And her argument was everything is a choice. And I said, it's a very privileged thing to say everything is a choice because yes, for me and the majority of people that listen to my podcast, I would say everything is a choice, right? I would encourage every single person, I tell them every single day, go for a walk because I know that a lot of people who listen to my podcast are in situations where they can go for a 1 hour walk or a half an hour walk every single day. And they're not, in a very challenging situation where they don't even have 10 minutes to themselves. But, I think there is this notion online and I've been kind of sometimes ignorant to it, is you can do everything you put your mind to and everyone has equal opportunity and everyone has the same 24 hours in their day. No, they don't. They actually don't. And if you believe that they do, you really aren't exposed to that. And, I've watched so many series now and I look at people's lives. Like, for example, I watched Top Boy. Have you seen it?
Yes. Yeah.
I watched that and I just thought, I cannot understand how people in this situation who are born in this situation, I do not blame any of them from going into the drug business. I don't. How do you get out of it? You cannot. And we don't have the right people going in there to talk to them, the support, the questions that they should be asked in school to detract people from doing that. We don't. And then we say, oh, it's so bad that there's such a big drug business. What's the alternative for these people? I just don't. I would 100% go into it. I mean, if I saw my parents struggling and someone at school told me, look, you can just do it for a bit and you can make a bit of money. You're a child. You have empathy for your parent. You want to make their life better. How do we change that problem?
So what you've just said about your friend saying everything is a choice, to an extent, that's true. What is different is the context within which those choices are being made.
Yes.
So everyone can be presented with the same choice. Do you go for a walk today or don't you go for a walk today?
But do I leave my kids at home and get arrested for it? It's a choice.
There's a different context within which those choices are being made. Some people have a context that supports them to make healthy decisions. It's the same thing with, these narratives around food, right?
Yes.
There's a lot of stuff today about ultra-processed food, for example. Some people, especially this is a problem in the US, literally live in healthy food deserts where it is impossible for them to actually access healthy food. A lot of other people can't afford to buy fruits and vegetables because they've become so much more expensive and it's extremely cheap to go and buy a Big Mac, for example. So yes, we all face these choices.
It's actually not that cheap to buy a Big Mac anymore. It's like £8, isn't it?
Oh my God, is it
it's
really?
Really expensive? Ooh, yeah.
Gosh, wow.
But for example, buying like waffles or chicken nuggets in the freezer and having that with some frozen peas or something, is cheaper
Yeah.
than perhaps making like a vegetable stew or a vegetable, I don't know, bake or something. So yes, I mean, I think that's a topic for another day.
Yeah.
But I'm actually really passionate about that, and I feel very strongly about that because it's very easy to judge someone in a situation that they're in. It's the same thing with smoking. I know people say, "Oh, well, I've seen people on benefits and they smoke," right? And I don't know why it winds me up so much, because I think people have vices and people are given like one cigarette and it calms them down, and then they think, well, I'll have that instead of food. It's not like they're having that. And it's the same with homeless people. People will be like, they're just going to use the money on cigarettes. I don't know. I have a very, people attacked me on this when I talked about this in another podcast.
No, I think you're right. It's just what you're saying is that you have empathy, which is
I get it.
the ability to imagine someone else's internal world, the ability to imagine, take homelessness, for example.
Yeah, I'm very passionate about it.
Well, yeah, no. And you know what? There is a huge proportion of homeless people who have come from the children's social care system, who have been looked after children. So, often living in foster care or in insecure accommodation for their entire childhoods. They have no sense of security.
Exactly.
They have deep scars
Yeah.
from having been raised in that environment. And when you're going through that level of suffering, we all know what it's like to struggle with our mental health, right? Imagine what it's like to have that times 10,000 embedded
only
every
thing you
day.
know.
Exactly.
But a lot of people don't come from that. I volunteer on Wednesdays, and every
that's
time I
great.
speak to people who are homeless, do you know what they tell me? I came from Manchester to London to have a job. One of them said it was an in-house pub job. I got here and he told me he didn't want me anymore. I had no money.
Oh my God.
I couldn't go back. One of them was so sad. He said, I looked after my dad my whole life. He was always poorly. So I didn't go to school. I didn't study because I was always looking after him. When he died, he left everything to my mum. My mum got a new boyfriend and the boyfriend kicked me out. This is why I'm homeless. We think that these people, were drinking all the time and taking drugs all the time, and that's why they're on the street and they deserve it. It's kind of the situation that you're telling me about earning it. I had this perception, right, at the start of this podcast is people earn their way to the top. And I actually disagree on the opposite end, which is they don't deserve it. Nobody wakes up and thinks, I want to live on the street.
Yeah.
And a lot of the people you speak to who are homeless now, they just say, I've just become accustomed to it.
Yeah.
But all of these people that I meet, not one of them has actually come from that situation. Did you know that? Not one.
You know what?
They've all been people who have had jobs.
Yeah.
One of them actually, he said, I was an engineer, right? Wow. And I was doing all of this work. He told me he was on £4,000. A month.
Wow.
Or £4,000 a month. And he said he hurt his leg, and he said that he didn't get the insurance. He wasn't insured. They didn't have health insurance. So he had to pay all his money to get insurance for his knee problem or get physio or whatever. I can't remember what it was now. But he can't work again.
Wow.
And what does he do? It's so crazy to me that we walk past people who are homeless in the street and we ignore them. It actually makes me sick, because if you watch that on a movie, if you watch it on a show where you're just walking past them being like, yeah, you're a waste of space, or whatever people say to them, it's actually a bit messed up. That's kind of like what my mission in life is to do.
I think that is absolutely fantastic. And you're so right, because actually it's really been over the last, I think, like 10 years that we've seen this just astonishing increase in homelessness.
And it's because of this wealth inequality that we're talking
because of
about.
the wealth inequality. It's because of the broken housing system.
Yeah.
It's because of cuts to social security and all of those sorts of things. I remember reading the other day that there's a school in Peckham where half of the children are homeless. So they're not necessarily all on the streets, but they're living in temporary accommodation, going from hotel to hotel to hotel. No. They can't concentrate. They don't have kitchens. How are they supposed to eat proper food? And this is the type of thing that is like some of the policies that Rachel Reeves has introduced, for example, where she's saying we're cutting disability payments for, people who maybe have kids and families who need to support them. It's going to embed that kind of generational poverty and disadvantage, which, as you say, it scars people for life.
Yeah, and actually, it's similarly, these housing situations, they're not exactly, when you're saying hotels, by the way, I just want to clarify, they're like hellholes.
Yeah.
One time when we were helping out, actually, on a Wednesday, this woman, I said to her, oh, do you want something to eat? And she goes, yeah, I'll have another one because I'm eating for 2. And she lifted her coat and she was 8 months pregnant. And I said, are you living on the street? And she said, yeah, I have a house. No, they've given me a hotel.
Yeah.
It's in a basement. There's rats everywhere. So I prefer to sleep out here. How's her kid going to grow up?
Oh my God.
So these social housing situations, it's not like they're vetted. They gave her a hotel.
Yeah.
But she said there's rats everywhere. And she said, I can't even leave like a snack on the table because a rat will eat it.
do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think we need to do a part 2. There's so much.
Well, yeah, I agree. I want to hear more about the people that you're working with in London because,
I'll tell you about it
Please.
after. But yeah, no, thank you so much for coming. It's been really, really insightful. And I think what I've really loved about this is you've taught me so much, and hopefully everyone else at home has learned so much too.
You have also taught me a lot as well. And I've been really intrigued to get your insights as someone who, you know, we are probably from different parts of the political spectrum initially, but there's obviously a lot of commonality.
Yes.
If you care about the world and other people, right?
That's what I think it is. I don't actually think that. I actually don't think we're that far off. I just think that what we perceive to be as important has been taught to us in the wrong way.
I agree.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think if people actually thought about other people and had empathy and cared, I think we'd all be on the same page. Honestly, I really believe humans are so good.
Yes.
If we actually teach them the good things, they will resonate.
I actually think that's the biggest divide in politics. Whether you think people can be good or whether you think everyone is inevitably evil. And I'm very much on the good side.
How can people be evil? We're not taught to be evil. You learn to be evil. You're not born evil.
I agree.
Everyone's born good. Thank you. Thank you.